From Photonics Media, this is All Things Photonics, a podcast where we explore industry-shaping advancements in lasers, optics, imaging, metrology, and sensing. Each episode, we'll speak with some of the brightest minds in industry and research about the trends shaping the landscape of photonics.
Today's episode is brought to you by Hamamatsu Corporation, a leading manufacturer of devices for the generation and measurement of infrared, visible, UV light, and X-rays. Hamamatsu is dedicated to the advancement of photonics through extensive research and offers specialized systems for select applications. Visit hamamatsu.com to learn more.
Our quest on today's episode of All Things Photonics is to place the role of test on the integrated photonics value chain. Three converging factors challenge this undertaking. The first is complexity. Testing for photonic integrated circuitry requires a combination of sophisticated equipment, protocols, as well as technology and calibration know-how. As Chiara Alessandri of PICs design software developer Lucida Photonics noted in a Photonics Spectre article last year, PICs testing necessitates knowledge not just of test requirements, but of chip design, thermal and polarization control, and high-speed measurements. These requirements, Alessandri said, demand a depth of expertise held by only a handful of experts worldwide. Testing, in other words, is far more than just switch flipping. A second factor, chip designs may not be optimized to be tested. This reality ties to a broader conversation about standards in integrated photonics, and it's one that our guest today examines. If a chip or a wafer isn't designed to be tested using standard equipment or methods, it is inherently challenging to determine where on the PICs value chain test exists. A final factor involves the pace at which photonic integration is advancing. Indeed, it is impractical to develop and configure a custom test setup for every chip architecture. On the other hand, the inability to design for test hamstrings sustained innovation. Our guest, Iñigo Artundo, ponders all of this with regularity. As CEO of VLC Photonics, a Valencia, Spain-based photonic design and test house, Artundo occupies a critical link in the PICs value chain. It is discerning the location of that link that makes our conversation on test necessary to understand the photonics product development roadmap. Iñigo Artundo joins me on the All Things Photonics podcast up next. I want to begin by talking about the notion of design for test. It's not a facet, I guess, of the integrated photonics value chain that has commanded the broad industry focus of a packaging, integration, even metrology has commanded maybe more robust focus. So with that context in place, I want to ask, where does design for test or test more broadly fall in the integrated photonics value chain?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the podcast. It's a great podcast, actually. Testing, indeed, it's quite an important topic that many people tend to underestimate. So as you know, the development cycle of a photonic integrated circuit, same as an electronic integrated circuit, goes from different phases, from design to fabrication, testing, and packaging, right? And at VLC Photonics, we have been offering services for design and test for many years already. So we are quite familiar with all the different stages of the development of a photonic circuit, mostly on the design and test. And we have seen, actually, you have made an interview, I remember in the past, with Peter O'Brien from Tyndall Institute about packaging and the importance of packaging in photonic circuits. And in many cases, it's mentioned that packaging is 60 to 80% of the cost. And that is true, but it's not complete truth. I would say it's not only packaging, it's backend, right? And the backend is not only packaging, but packaging and testing. Testing starts at the fab side. So there is a lot of testing in the manufacturing of a photonic circuit, starting with all the metrology done at the foundries, right? But once the chips are fabricated, then it comes into the functional characterization of these devices, components or circuits at the die level or at the wafer level. You can also do this functional testing at the package level as well. And there is also a concept that is very much related to testing, which is reliability testing. So you need to make sure that these devices perform reliably under different circumstances and different stressors. So testing is quite important, I would say, because there are many things that you need to take into account. first you need to evaluate the fab tolerances, right? So as you know, photonic integration is not as mature as electronic integration. So foundry processes are not as mature as yielding, especially when you are developing maybe new processes or new products based on existing processes. So it's very important to get the fab tolerances right, because eventually you will also want to do a sensitivity analysis of the performance of your components of your circuits based on these tolerances, right? And overall, you also want to make sure that the circuit functionality that you design is according to specifications. So it's quite important. And considering this, then of course you require to introduce some considerations for testing when you do the design of your photonic circuit, and this is where PDKs and TDKs come into play typically.
So let's differentiate between those two things, TDKs and PDKs, process design kits, and of course test design kits. Obviously some commonalities, right, in the notion of the kit, but certainly some differences as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think TDK is not a concept that is well established on the industry. I think PDK is well established. It's a concept that comes from the microelectronics world. Typically, a PDK, a process design kit, is something that the foundries distribute to the end users and designers for proper fabrication of their layouts. And typically, this includes a set of design rules, the design rule deck, and also some scripts for example, doing things like layout versus schematic, to make sure that these chips are properly fabricated by the foundries. And typically, these are also implemented in software basis by different EDA vendors. Okay. Eventually, the TDK concept is the same, right? So we say that it's like test design kit, which is just a set of rules that designers need to observe to make sure that you are able later on to do proper testing. And by proper, I mean easier, faster, lower cost. Okay. So eventually, not the ones that are going to be fabricating these chips, but in this case, the ones that are going to be testing these chips, like test houses or OSATs, make sure that these are properly set. So typically, this is just a set of rules in a handbook, maybe a PDF file, and ideally also a software implementation that can be done at different photonic EDAs. Like, for example, we have been working with Lucida, with their PICs software, or also with Synopsys with the optocompiler, to make sure that they implement our set of test rules on their different softwares. Yeah.
You mentioned Lucida, and obviously there are numerous players, some more established than others, in the test space and the broader integrated photonics ecosystem. Obviously, you're speaking on behalf of VLC here, and VLC, by the nature of what it is doing, is supporting the broader integrated photonics and really photonics ecosystem. But there is this aspect of geography that I think is important. How do you view supporting photonics at home in Spain, at home in Europe, but also the growth of the technology globally?
Wow. Indeed, the technology has changed a lot in the last years, and there has been different efforts now geographically, both in Spain, in Europe, and in the US, to support photonic integration as such, not only the technology, but also the markets. I remember when we founded the company back in 2011, the technology was on its infancy, right? Since the last 14 years, we have been serving many customers. We have quite a broad view of the technology and the market nowadays, especially since the last 4 or 5 years since we were acquired by Hitachi. So in this case, now we are also much more exposed to what's happening globally, and especially in Asia. But the technology and the field has changed dramatically, I would say. Like 15 years ago, it was very much in R&D. I remember there were some initiatives, like in Europe mostly, like EPICS Fab or JEPICS, where they were trying to establish the concept of generic fabrication processes and the concept of a photonics foundry, right? And having like multi-project wafers set, etc. But it was mostly academics. Then around 10 years ago, it's when the real industrialization of photonic integration came up, by Intel starting to produce their transceivers in silicon photonics, ST doing that as well. The companies like Luxtera or Cotura pioneering this concept of silicon photonics, Infinera on indium phosphide as well. But it's in the last, I would say, 5 years where we have seen a tremendous market growth and scaling up by the big CMOS foundries coming into play, like the huge boom of data center transceivers, especially now with AI, with new applications coming up like LiDAR, quantum, or sensing. So this has represented a tremendous growth in not only in the market and the volumes, but also in the maturity of the technology. And in the last, I would say, 1 year or two, there has been also tremendous support by the governments themselves, because they have realized that semiconductors in general and photonics in particular are of a strategic importance. In Europe, the European Commission says it's a key enabling technology. Also in Spain, there has been significant recognition for that. So that's, for example, what's happening now with the CHIPS Act in the US, also in Europe with the CHIPS Joint Undertaking. In Spain, we have a similar program called the PERTE program, and this has allowed to develop many ecosystems around photonic integration. But I would say still there is a big difference in terms of what is required as technology development and what can be done with this public funding, because remember that the maturity still between electronics and photonics is quite different. So funding programs should also be different as well. Yeah.
Today's episode is brought to you by LightPath Technologies. From concept through prototyping, volume production, and global distribution, LightPath has the optical and infrared imaging knowledge and manufacturing expertise to be your optics and thermal imaging solutions partner every step of the way. Visit lightpath.com to learn more.
I want to take you back maybe 15 years ago and take the notion of test back 15 years ago. When things are deeply rooted in R&D, are considerations for something like test or even process given full consideration? Or has it been in the last 5 years, as commercialization has really ramped up, that the notion of test has become something that is really sort of baked into the life cycle of a PIC?
Sure. When we started, characterization was mostly being done. And characterization meaning taking a few dies and evaluating or measuring all the different characteristics of this photonic chip or component and making sure that it works. And that's okay when you are doing R&D or prototyping, product development. But in the last 5 years, what we have noticed is that most of our customers are beyond that point, and they are already industrializing and trying to scale up. So what we are seeing now is that it's not that much characterization anymore. What is required is actually proper testing, meaning that testing is mostly done for sorting out good, non-good dies, moving into higher volumes, not testing tens of chips, but hundreds, thousands, or obviously wafer level, doing wafer level and then being able to test thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of chips at the wafer level, yes. So that to me, this scalability has been the main differentiation in the last 5 years, right?
So in that talking, we'll say 2018 or 2019 to the present time, that last 5 years, that 5-year period, how have the principal challenges for the test space evolved? Because now you're working or partnering with companies who are fairly far along on their roadmaps. How, for testing explicitly, how has the challenge evolved?
So I would say that, first of all, volumes is one of the key challenges. Scaling up to the volumes that some applications require, not only in terms of dies, but also in terms of wafers. So automation is very much needed. And there are challenges there to scale up, obviously, in terms of the probing systems. For example, in terms of the light probing, light coupling, in some cases, many applications require edge coupling versus vertical coupling. And doing edge coupling at the wafer level is not trivial. We have been mastering this technique for the last 2 years, where if you have a trench on the wafer, then we embed some kind of periscopes to be able to do edge coupling at the wafer level. Another big challenge, I believe, especially for high-speed communications like data center transceivers, is testing RF, very high frequencies, especially when you work with the latest generation of modulators. So, but not only the testing of the modulator itself, but also the transmitter, right, as a system. So being able to test things like the bit error testing, the eye diagram, things like that. So, for example, we have been equipping ourselves with instrumentation to be able to reach 110 gigahertz testing up to 112 gigabaud, things like that. Then moving from communications, there are big challenges when testing things that are not communications, like visible wavelengths or ultraviolet wavelengths or mid-infrared wavelengths, which are, for example, used for many sensing applications, right? So there are many challenges there. And I would say the last one maybe related to reliability. Typically, reliability is done, or it used to be done, in optical components at the individual component level. So, for example, testing individual lasers or individual photodetectors or individual modulators. But now what we are seeing is that you have very complex photonic circuits with tens, hundreds, thousands of components, right? Where you may have several lasers on the same chip, several modulators. So doing these reliability studies for complex photonic circuits is really challenging.
You mentioned this differentiation in growth a couple minutes ago, LiDAR in detection and ranging versus what we may consider more traditional communications, datacom, telecom. There's also a differentiation in material platforms, right? Curious to get your thoughts on how you see that from the platform that your position creates on the test side of things, because you're not just working with silicon anymore, right? Or any one material, you're working with many. Is that a consideration? And assuming that it is, how do you measure that?
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Unfortunately, I would say in photonic integration, materials are not as standardized as in microelectronics. So there are different materials nowadays being used for different applications. Most well known, obviously, is silicon photonics. But as we know, we cannot have lasers on silicon due to the material properties. So that's why 3-5 materials like indium phosphide or gallium arsenide come into play. But then you also have other CMOS compatible materials like silica or silicon nitride that are used also for guiding visible wavelengths or having very low loss propagation or high power waveguides. And then there is this new generation of materials being introduced for being able to reach higher speeds for modulation. I'm talking about, for example, electro-optical polymers. I'm talking about graphene. I'm talking about barium titanate, lithium niobate. And for us, as a design house or test house, we are pretty material agnostic, and we work with many foundries working with all these materials. But of course, each of these materials has its own key features that you need to make sure you understand in order to design or test for them. So it's not trivial to change from one material to the other. And you have to be very careful in each of these choices, yes.
On the one hand, you talk about companies evolving and growing and progressing in their roadmaps, but the nature of integrated photonics, and I think of packaging and test particularly, maybe test most of all, is that you're working with companies at all life cycle or sort of in all phases of their evolution, right? Young companies, old companies, and startup companies. What's the message that you have to startup companies, both in terms of the technology piece of it, but maybe more generally, someone entering the commercial side of integrated photonics here in now 2025?
Yeah. Yeah. I have so many pieces of advice here, because we have been, as I told you, for the last 14 years working with many companies in this field, developing products. And we have seen all kinds of applications being taken to the market or trying to make it to the market. And we work with many startups that are developing products. And I think one of the key things I would say is that time to market is very critical. It's always, right, in every field. But I think in photonic integration, considering how quickly the technology is developing and also how fast the markets that these applications are targeting are developing, time to market is key. And you have to consider that typically what we are seeing in any deep tech startup working with hardware, not software, typically development time easily can take 2 to 5 years, in some cases more than that, depending on the application. Of course, this is now lowering due to the higher maturity of the photonic integration technology. And that is good. But being able to carefully estimate the time to market and make sure that you reach that whenever you want is key. Also, they required investment. We have seen a lot of people coming from academia to industry with some very good ideas, some early stage prototypes. But in order to take that into a product that can make it to the market, it's not only the photonic chip. Obviously, there are many things around that: the control electronics, the mechatronics, the software, reliability studies, certifications, all these kind of things. So for that, you require significant investment. Depends obviously on the application, depends on the market, depends on your business model. But I would say in average, we are talking about 10, 20, up to 30 million euros we are seeing for well-funded startups. So this is fundamental to be taken into consideration on your business plan.
That is a good point, really, not just for startups, for all of us, that there are more considerations than I think we all plan for, especially in a move from R&D to commercialization and productization. I want to end with this question, and it's a bit of a long-winded one, and I'm going to ask it maybe in an indirect way. It's about sort of future looking and what we can expect to see in the upcoming months and years. But I'm going to ask you just in terms of PICs development specifically, in the PICs development lifecycle, where do you see the most opportunity for innovation? At what phase of the development cycle or maybe the commercialization cycle do you see as having the most robust opportunity for someone to step in or a company to step in and make noticeable change?
Mm-hmm. Well, I see opportunities everywhere, actually, because it's so exploding technology and market that there are so many opportunities. On the design side, we work closely on the design and test. So on the design side, we see plenty of opportunities using AI for doing inverse design or very complex circuits, with hundreds or even thousands of components. There are also innovations not only on the technology, but also on the business model, trying to follow up what is happening in the last decades in electronics with the licensing business model of core IPs. Also, all the co-design with electronics, which is fundamental, especially for high-speed transmitters or transceivers. On the fabrication side, we have talked about the new materials, the combination of photonics with MEMS, for example. All the research needed or the developments being able to pump the yields high, or especially on fiber coupling, which is also a very hot topic, and obviously on hybrid integration, making sure that you are able to integrate the traditional silicon photonics or silicon nitride with other materials, maybe using different hybridization techniques or things like microtransfer printing. And especially related to this, also packaging. One of the biggest challenges also beyond what I've mentioned already in testing is on packaging. I'm talking about things like wafer level packaging. I mentioned microtransfer printing, being able to do fiber pigtailing at very high volumes at low cost with good tolerances of fiber arrays as well, pluggable fiber connectors. So many opportunities in every single stage of the development.
Every time I have a conversation like this, I'm just reminded of all the sort of sub-disciplines that come together to move integrated photonics forward. You mentioned mechatronics, and it's the math that's required, MEMS, and some of the work happening, not just in research anymore, but on the industry side too. It is a truly exciting time. Iñigo, thank you so much for joining us. And obviously, March is a busy month. We've got the EPIC AGM. We've got OFC coming up, and we'll see you on the road.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
With that, we conclude another episode of All Things Photonics. Thank you to our sponsors, to the technical staff behind the scenes, and to continued support from the Photonics Media editorial team. As always, questions, comments, thoughts, and ideas are welcome. Let us know how we're doing via email at allthings@photonics.com. All Things Photonics is available on all major platforms and on our website, photonics.com.